uh, Ann Whitney Olin Professor in the Departments of Anthropology at Barnard College and Columbia University, co-director of the Center for Palestine Studies, and chair of the governing board of the Society of Fellows, the Hyman Center for the Humanities at Columbia University. And we've put in a chat link to her piece about the detention of Mahmoud Khalil in the New York Review of Books, which if you haven't read, I would really encourage you to. So Nadia, thank you for doing this.
Of course. Thanks. I should say that my website is so far out of date that I am no longer chair of the Center for the
Oh,
Humanities.
okay. My apologies. That happens to me a lot.
No, my apologies. I really need to deal with
People often read things off of my website, and I find that, yeah, that I'm doing something
it.
completely different than those websites
Yeah,
suggest.
exactly.
So in the piece in the New York Review of Books, you talk about Mahmoud Khalil as a person and what he's like and how you got to know him. So maybe we could just start there. If you could just talk for those people who never have encountered him and now only know him as a public presence, what is he like as a person?
So I really got to know him during the encampment because him and one other student were the negotiators with the administration. And I spent an endless amount of time there. As I told them, my limit was I was not going to spend the night in a tent. I was too old for that. But I hung out with them. I mean, I wasn't there as a protester, but to just keep an eye on what was happening, because obviously, I mean, this started with the first encampment. I spent, we knew by 11 a.m. that Minouche was going to bring in the cops the first day. There was no negotiating. But anyway, so he consulted a lot with me and talked about the administration and things. And I would just say he's both the most soft-spoken, gentle person I've ever met. I mean, the statement that he released the other day from prison, I don't know if any of you have seen it, it's worth reading, really is him. I mean, he's this deeply thoughtful, temperate, calm person who was obviously an important leader and part of the movement, but also a real mediator. He's, somewhat older. I mean, he's older than the undergrads. His own life experiences, have made him, I would say, older than his age. He fled, he grew up in a refugee camp outside of Damascus. He fled on his own in about 2011, sometime to Beirut without his family. So, he's pretty young at that point, barely 20, um, and was a refugee in Lebanon and had to learn English. In fact, by some coincidence, a PhD student of mine who's Syrian taught him English in Beirut. And sort of against all odds, got an undergraduate degree and then found his way to SIPA. So he's had a heck of a lot of, and when he first got to in Lebanon, he had no money. I'm pretty sure he worked as a construction worker or something to help make himself survive. So he's like older than his age. He's quite wise. And I don't know. I mean, I've been thinking a lot about the decision to target him. And partly it's because, of course, at that point, a lot of students had started hiding their faces because at that point they were worried about doxing, but they were really worried about the administration. But he chose not to, as did many of the Palestinian leaders at that point, including Palestinian Americans. And in some sense, they're going after him because he was a leader. But there is nothing in anything that man has ever said or done that one could even accuse him of quote unquote, supporting terrorism. I mean, even verbally, right? So I sort of feel like, I mean, partly he was chosen, of course, because he was a public figure and, you know, this was a targeted attack. He was someone who was out there publicly because he's very committed to the cause. And he really didn't think, he could get arrested for speech, right? He's not someone who got arrested in either of the encampments. He did not go into Hamilton Hall. Um, but I also think there's something about taking out the voices of a movement who can speak to a broader audience that's not an accident, right? He is somebody that if people would actually listen to him as opposed to all the claims by Canary Mission and Betar and documenting Jew hate and the alumni group and some of my pretty awful colleagues, if you actually listen to his words, he's someone who could be a very powerful spokesperson who can build a much wider coalition. And I do think that's why many faculty felt about him last year. So it's a choice that I think is no accident, right? Both because of his leadership and because I think, in a way, everyone knows he's the kind of person that can bring along a much larger coalition. Um,
What uh I'm curious, you said that the Palestinian and Palestinian American students chose generally not to wear masks. Um, maybe you can just say a little bit more about what because this mask wearing thing has become such a kind of topic of discussion. If you can explain why you think those students who wore masks did choose to wear them, and why you think, on balance, the Palestinian and Palestinian American students chose not to.
well, students were not wearing masks from the beginning.
Mhm.
Um, I mean, if we go back to the fall of 2023, I think students began masking up around February of last year. So, and it was after the Barnard administration used facial recognition. I mean, they used both electronic facial recognition and they sent out deans who were supposed to be deans of students whose job should be to protect students to identify students who were part of a demonstration on Barnard's campus early. I think it was late January or sometime in February 2024. Um, I mean, I should say kids who were just walking by, in particular kids who were Hajj, they were walking by, got swept up into disciplinary hearings, even though they weren't participants. But between the rise in doxing and, I have a student who had a death threat put under her door in Brooklyn. Someone found her um, address and literally slipped a note under her door. So between anxiety about doxing, but also anxiety about discipline, as the university on both sides of the street heated up, students started putting on masks. They're putting on masks to hide themselves from the disciplinary harshness of the university. Um, and that increased more and more with the encampments. I think the students who had already been leaders, I think it was a combination of things. They were already the leaders, they were already out there. I think for many Palestinian students, this is a cause that's so important. I mean, they say this is the risk I take, right? Their commitment is just that's what the commitment is. And I also think profoundly felt like, well, we're not doing anything wrong, right?
Mhm.
I mean, at that point, there's fear of the administration, but I think people made choices. I think, the people that were going to be spokespeople made the choice to take the risk against administrative practice. And we were in a different moment where, I would never defend the Biden administration on any grounds on the Israel, the Gaza slaughter, but they weren't arresting people for speech. So I
Right.
also think things just shifted really dramatically and really quickly. And to be honest, I think many of us, as people who've been around longer, saw this coming. They didn't. I see an incredible panic that has hit in the last, month, and then of course with Mahmoud's arrest and the Indian graduate student who really was never part of the protests, who got picked up because she liked some posts or they tried to pick her up, and there's another student who is in hiding at the moment. I think first of all, I think for some of them it's too late anyway. They are public figures. They're being doxxed. Their names are being sent to the ICE, to the White House. We know that. We know alumni. There's an alumni uh, or a WhatsApp group that The Intercept reported on, right, where parents and alum are getting their own kids to pass names and they're passing them along. So I think in some sense it's too late for them anyway. But now the risk has shifted, right? When they were first making this decision, the risk was suspension or some kind of discipline from Columbia. I also think people were not focused on the possibility of expulsion because there have been virtually no expulsion. I mean, there have been the lawyers working with these students have put together a file. Basically, Columbia has expelled people for political speech. One person who was led an anti-Nazi demonstration in the 30s got expelled. One person who was involved in the 68 takeover got expelled, but he'd held a dean hostage for 24 hours. Those are the only two cases of expulsion for political speech in the history of the university that people could dig up. Barnard actually turns out their last expulsion was 1968, and it was because a woman was living with her boyfriend, they found out. Um, so I also think, what was the risk? Suspension. I also think they just didn't think expulsion was on the table.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. So do you
and none
have
of those students, by the way, none of the Palestinian students went into Hamilton Hall. So